In this lecture, we will introduce response to intervention and multi-tiered support systems. The objectives for this lecture are for you to be able to list assumptions of an RTI program, evaluate considerations in order to build a successful RTI program, and finally, understand the 3 tiers of support in our traditional multi-tiered assessment model. I want to open with a quote about what RTI is and its purpose. This quote, "The purpose of RTI is to ensure high levels of learning for every child, and our actions must be guided by that purpose." Response to intervention truly is helping us map a way to stay dedicated to the highlighted purpose, which is ensuring that all students are learning at a high level. First, let's dive into the acronym RTI. You may see this written differently: RTII, RT little I, RT big I. So generally the I can stand for instruction or intervention. When we're referring to this, we're generally referring to both of these things happening because the intervention and the instruction are all guided by this system. So many different models, a few different names. Later we'll get into MTSS, but all of these models share a couple things. First, there's multiple tiers, typically 3 tiers of interventions for service delivery. Progress monitoring and ongoing data collection is used to determine student progress and what type of support and the intensity of the support students need for a given topic or area of focus. There are assumptions within RTI that have to be true in order for this to be an effective model. First, we assume that instruction is occurring and that instruction is occurring as planned. These 2 things are important as interventions are often very detailed and they have to be delivered with fidelity. So again, we're assuming that instruction is happening and it's happening as planned, so there are not large disruptions to learning. Assessment needs to be linked to a form of collecting data, so a measurement system that can detect change in student learning. This is frequent progress monitoring, and you want to make sure that things are written in a very specific manner when we're measuring student learning goals so that we can see even the small amounts of progress. For example, if we're talking about fluency, we're going to look at things like words per minute. That way we can see growth even if it's just 1 word per minute over time. But with frequency of data collection, hopefully we would see more change over a amount of time. Again, assessment is linked to instruction and instructional decisions linked to modifying that instruction. And the consequences of student improvement and student learning are implemented with consideration to the data that's collected. Finally, one of the most important considerations and assumptions that we have in RTI is that assessment is not setting specific. So everything in an RTI model could and should happen in a general education classroom. So not setting specific, all of this can happen in an inclusive classroom. Some considerations are, first, intervention integrity. And this becomes more and more true in terms of the tiers of intervention. We want to make sure that interventions are occurring and again that it is happening as planned. So this is really systematic delivery of interventions. And that in itself really promotes integrity. To further boost that integrity, you want to make sure whoever is delivering the intervention has been trained in this, as well as trained in how to implement the assessments. It's important that interventions are deemed effective, and there should be some research behind a particular intervention that's being used. One thing I recommend is looking at What Works Clearinghouse to review any research that has been done about a particular curriculum or intervention curriculum that you might be using within a district. Some other considerations that you want to keep in mind are how a student is responding over time and if that is consistent. So, are they consistently improving? Are they consistently remaining stable until they receive a certain level of information? These are important questions to help us consider developing a plan for a student's learning. Finally, we want to consider the frequency of progress monitoring or data collection. How often are we assessing all students, most students, and some small group of students? These are things that need to be built into your assessment plan that you do throughout the year. Multi-tiered support systems and RTI are often used interchangeably. Multi-tiered support systems, or MTSS, is a service model where you're delivering specific interventions. And again, we're referring to the levels of support in this particular model. This can be implemented for both academics and behavior. In an MTSS model, typically you see a pyramid. In our bottom pyramid, we have the majority of our students, typically about 80% of our students, who can have their needs met through a research-based core instructional unit or curriculum. When we go up to our secondary tier, this is when some levels of progress monitoring are needed and some support is needed to support student growth. Finally, we have our third tier up at the top where we have intensive intervention. Often these are individualized or smaller groups of 1 to 3 students. So again, if we look at this model, we can discuss assessments that go along with each model. In our bottom level, we have students who are universally screened for particular skills. This is everyone receives an assessment to determine how they are comparing A with their peers and B, how they are mastering a particular content area. So typically, universal screenings are general reading assessments or general math assessments. When we go up to the second and third tier, we increase the amount of progress monitoring that is happening. So in this case, students may have mini assessments or have data collected bi-weekly, weekly, or sometimes multiple times a week, depending on the particular goal. As the supports increase, the intensity of instruction and interventions and progress monitoring goes up, and the size of instructional groups go down. In earlier slides, we discussed that these can be used for both academic and behavioral instruction. Again, at the bottom, we have about 80 to 90% of students who can be served through universal supports. Moving up, we have about 5 to 10% of students who might need additional supports. And then finally, about 1 to 5% of students would need a high level of intensity intervention in order to make adequate progress. Typically, these can be school or classroom-wide systems. There are many different ways of representing an MTSS model. In this, it's a little bit different than the traditional format, but typically the implementation of the model is exactly the same. So as we can see, students who are receiving universal instruction then can enter more targeted instruction, and then very intensive instruction. The number of students are decreasing as supports become more intensive. In terms of assessment, one of the things that we want to do when we see a student who might be at risk, who is currently receiving instruction in a whole class model or within a tier 3 level, we first want to identify a problem, and often that is done through progress monitoring if a screener doesn't pick up the particular problem that we want to focus on. After we analyze the problem through looking at the data, we provide some targeted interventions. If the student makes progress, they can either A, go back to tier 3 and receive supports in the whole class, or they can continue to receive the level 2 supports. One of the things to keep in mind is that moving through the levels of support should be really fluid, and one student shouldn't live in a particular group. You can move through differently over time based on subject, particular topics, or content areas. Finally, if a student is still struggling to make adequate progress in Tier 2, then we again work to identify the problem and increase both the interventions and the progress monitoring that is implemented. When an MTSS model or RTI are implemented correctly, some really great things happen. First, there's a higher quality of instruction in a general education classroom. This can reduce the number of students who are receiving special education services and reduce the number of referrals to special education, because students who are at risk are receiving intense interventions right away and they're not left to fail. Assessments can help make decisions on what a student needs. So those meaningful assessments can help pinpoint what difficulties are so we can remediate them as quickly as possible. These consistent interventions can bring a student up to a level of proficiency before they are left behind and need special education services. So again, a multi-tiered support model really supports students right in the moment, and we're not waiting to provide a more lengthy evaluation process through the special education process in order to give them services. So it's a great way to meet students' needs by leveling their particular intensity of interventions and support and backing those decisions up by progress monitoring. This week, I want you to look at what's happening with your district in terms of RTI or MTSS. You're going to be making some notes about this particular model in your assignment 1. Please ask your cooperating teacher or administration if and how they might be implementing these models. If you have any questions, please contact your professor. Thank you.